Hi, my name is James Jansen. I have a PhD in the mathematical modelling of HIV. I did modelling for 6 years of my life, trying all different sorts of models. So I have a fair bit of experience in this space, and I think I have a fair bit to say about which models we should or shouldn't be using. And the title of today's talk is Compartmental Models Used by Some Governments to Model COVID-19 Critically Underestimate Our Ability to Control the Epidemic. So there are a lot of models being used right now that are possibly causing a lot of problems for governments in terms of their planned response. So it seems to be getting quite popular to do modeling. There's a lot of at-home modelers, but some of the more established modelers are actually getting quite famous. This paper was published in Nature just a few days ago. And there are lots of online and open source tools, including ones that are used by government. This is an example of it, covidsim.eu, that uses a compartmental SEIR model. And I'll explain what that means in a little while. But these compartmental models are used to make very important decisions. New Zealand is using the covidsim.eu, the version 1.0 compartmental SEIR model. England is using the Imperial College compartmental SEIR model, and Australia is using the Doherty Institute's compartmental model. And these are all models clearly made by competent modelers, but there's an issue with the type of model. Compartmental models give an overly pessimistic view of the likelihood of success of short, sharp intervention strategies that could see society return to normal sooner. The reason for this is compartmental models poorly model interactions between people, and they poorly model infection resolution. So when a person goes from being infected to being healthy again and unable to pass on the infection. So to begin with, I'm going to introduce the difference between the compartmental models and agent-based models. When I talk about this model, I'm going to do it in terms of a little bit more simplified and SIR, not SEIR model. So I'll explain what that means. SEIR stands for susceptible, exposed, infected, and recovered. So there are 4 different categories there. I'm taking out the exposed. I'm just looking at susceptible, so people who aren't infected, the infected group, and the recovered group, the people who are no longer capable of passing on the infection. But even though I've simplified it, the principles of the issues with the model are the same. It's a very simplified model, so please don't use it for making government decisions. Don't use it for making your personal health decisions, and don't use it for making decisions about your company and investments and all that kind of stuff. It's too simple. It doesn't contain enough information. So you can have a look at the model. It's at covidagentmodel.com, and you can also download the source code from GitHub if you want to. The link is there, so you can pause it and write it down if you want. But if you do want to have a more detailed model that goes through all the different things and makes a more accurate prediction, please email me, and either I can help you create a model or I can put you in contact with someone who can. There are plenty of modelers out there who can do this for you, so please contact me. Don't use this model for any of your own decisions. So back to what a compartmental model is. It works by having only a few variables that represent the state of the system. So like I was saying before, susceptible, infected, and recovered. And the people who start in the susceptible pile, as they get infected, they start to move into the infected pile. And the people who are in the infected pile, as they start to get better, they move into the recovered pile. And they do this at a very predictable rate in a compartmental model. So with this equation here, you have A, that's a constant. I is the number of infected people, And this term here represents the proportion of people who are currently susceptible to the infection. So to go back, this part here says that the number of people who turn from being susceptible into infected is proportional to the number of people who are currently infected. If you go from 1 person to 2 people, you'll double the number of people who are infected. If you go up to 10 people who are currently infected, those 10 people can infect 10 times as many people. And this term here says that eventually there's going to be so many people who are infected that all the connections between the infected people are getting saturated with people who have already been infected and or maybe recovered. So the rate at which they can infect more people is lowered. And so that's what this part of that term does. For the process of going from infected to recovered, you have this term here. And this B is a constant. It's saying that at each step, the number of people who move from infected to recovered are proportional to the number of currently infected people. And so what happens is you start with some base assumption. Here I've got 100,000 people, 100 of whom are infected and none of them are recovered. In the next step, those 100 people caused 26.1 new infections, and the number of people who are recovered, the number of people who've moved from being infected to recovered come out to 4.8. And you keep on doing this process for day 1, day 2, day 3, until you work out what the resolution of the epidemic is. This, for the mathematicians out there, this system resolves to a set of equations that look like this. So you've got, let me just bring up a highlighter. You've got the number of susceptible people in the next step is equal to the number of susceptible in the current step, and you take away the number of people who are moving into the infected step, and that's that term here. When you look at that, the next step, the infected people, the infected people in the next step are equal to the currently infected people plus the people who just came in from the susceptible group minus the people who've moved out of this infected group and into the recovered group. And likewise, the recovered group is in the next step is equal to the recovered group currently plus the number of people who are moving in from the infected group. Okay, so that gives you a brief introduction of how these compartmental models work. The other type of model which is popular, and the one which I like to use the most, is an agent-based model. So agent-based models keep track of much more information about the system that is important to infection spread and recovery. Each individual is stored separately, and the state of each individual is updated independently of the other individuals. So you have all these little nodes in the system, and they represent individuals who are, they have their own age, they have their own date of infection, they have their own date of recovery, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot more data being stored. In the previous system, you really only had a few numbers. The total number of susceptible, the total number of infected, and the total number of recovered. In this model, you need to keep track of whether this person is infected, and this person is infected, and this person is infected, and whether they're recovered, and whether they've died, what their age are, so on and so forth. Okay, let me just clear that off. To run an agent-based model, what you do is you place, you make one or many of your agents infected. And you can see here, we've just converted one of these agents to a orange circle. And then we move it through each day. So we go from day 0 to day 1. And with each step, there's a probability that they pass on the infection. And by day 3 here, you see there's this original individual has passed it on to another individual. So now we have 2 people who are infected into the model. And then we keep on running the simulation. And then that person, those 2 people result in an infection in this person here. Keep running the model. More and more people are infected, remembering to keep track of each of those people when they're infected and when they recovered. Eventually, we have someone who's recovered. That original person who was infected becomes recovered. So now that person, because they're recovered, they can't pass, these 2 people can't directly pass on that infection through this person here to this person at the top, because this person in green is recovered. So we keep going. Day 12, more people infected, more people recovered. And then eventually you'll find that all the people are recovered. And the cool thing about agent-based models is that they behave under the hood how you expect epidemics to work in real life. You keep track of all the people, when they were infected and when they recovered, and who they're connected to. And that means that they're going to be a bit more accurate when you implement your interventions. There's another way in which these are very different, and that is when it comes to simulating the recovery of individuals. The 2 models behave very differently. So to begin with, I'll explain to you the compartmental model. So this is a demonstration model that I built to show people like you the difference between a compartmental model and a individual-based model. You can see, and you can view this at covidagentmodel.com. You can see at the top here, you've got the setting is to compartmental model. To make this system only demonstrate the the rate at which people recover from their infection, what we do is we set the model duration to 50 days, we set the number of people to 100, and we set the number of infected people to 100. So 100% of people in this model are infected. And then what we do is we set the median time until recovery to 14 days, which is a fair assumption. I mean, there's going to be quite a bit of differences in assumptions about how long this infection lasts, but this is just an example. Okay, so coming back to how that compartmental model works, what we're doing is we're looking at this part of the equation here. The constant b is chosen to make the median time until recovery equal 14 days. So what we actually did, we worked out exactly what b has to be to make recovery 50% of people recovered at 14 days. And it turns out to be 4.8%. So you'll see here we've got 100 people initially infected. We do one step. 4.8% of people are moved out of the infected into the recovered compartment. And then the next step, another 4.8% people are moved. And you can see here that this number here is slightly smaller. It's only 4.6% because 4.8% of 92.5 people here. And we keep on doing that step by step by step by step. And then eventually we show that half of the people are recovered by 14 days. The thing about this type of model though, is that it's what's called an exponential decay. No matter how long you run this thing, there will always be a few people who are left in the infected. It goes from 50 down to 47, down to 45, down to 43. And even when it gets down to very, very small numbers, there's always just a little bit of infected people left over. So there's a problem with that. And that is that the exponential decay never reaches 0. And that means that there's always infected people in the model. And how that looks on a graph, we'll just show you the number of people infected is in red, the number of people who are recovered is in green. And here you can see half of the people recovered at 14 days. But then you've got this big problem with the number of infected people, because you have this massive fat tail of unrecovered people, and that goes out to infinity. So your model never actually clears all of the infected people. There's always just a few infected people left in the system. And that causes problems when you're trying to do behavioral interventions, where you say, we're going to cut off all the contacts between the people. And we are going to quarantine people and stop this infection from happening. Doesn't matter how long you keep them in quarantine, there are still going to be people who are left over. By contrast, simulating the recovery of individuals in an agent-based model, what I was able to do, because we were looking at the people on an individual basis, I set the model so that after their infection date, we set the recovery date to exactly 14 days, plus a random value between -7 and 7. So that means that some of the people will be recovered after 7 days, and some people might take up to 21 days, or they could be anywhere between those two values, between 7 days and 21 days. And the way that we did this in the COVID agent model, set the simple agent model setting up here. Same settings with the model duration and the number of people, 50 for the model duration, and the number of people set to 100, and the initial infected also 100. Same median time until recovery here. And if you look at that graph, what you'll see is a bit of a different profile. People start to recover after 7 days here, the red line here of infected people. After 14 days, half of them are recovered. And then at 21 days, all of the people are recovered. And when we put these two models side by side, these are incredibly different outcomes for the individuals in this model. In the compartmental model, you have exponential decay and the infected never goes to 0. Whereas the agent-based model has a custom recovery profile, such as a minimum and a maximum time until recovery. And this is really the biggest failure of compartmental models. A fundamental assumption of epidemiology is that infections have a finite duration, except in very special cases, such as HIV, which was my previous field of study. But for something like COVID, like the flu, like the common cold, people are going to clear them. Now, this assumption is used routinely in quarantine interventions. You get someone who's sick, you put them in quarantine, and hopefully you cut off this infection from everyone else. Compartmental models do not adequately model the finite nature of infections such as COVID-19, and therefore compartmental models cannot determine the outcome of our current lockdowns. So we can't run this model and work out whether it's going to work or not. So I just might move where my head is up to here. So let's look at what it looks like when we simulate an uncontrolled epidemic. So to begin with, I will use a compartment model. I will change the number of people up to 100,000. So we still have 100 days, 100,000 people in the model. Only 100 of them are infected. Same time until recovery. But now we have a setting that indicates the transmission between the infected and the susceptible population. And in our model, this is just an example. We're saying that there's a doubling every 3 days. There's going to be different doubling rates depending on the population. It really depends on how connected people are. We've chosen every 3 days for this example. So we set the rate at which people move from susceptible into the infected, that constant A in our first equation to 0.31. So looking closely at this epidemic, you see that the susceptible in blue goes from 100,000, and by day 70, almost all of those 100,000 people are completely infected. The infected population peaks at around about day 35, and then you can see in green that the recovered population goes up to nearly 100,000. You'll also notice that down here in the bottom right, you have that red curve at day 100 is still pretty high. We also, I used the simple agent model to, once again, same duration, same number of people, but this time instead of having the the rate at which infected people infect susceptible people, we have an average number of connections per person and the infection probability per connection per person per day. And so that's this value here. And so I've adjusted those levels until a person with 20 contacts per person has, if they infect 0.014 people per day, that represents a doubling of the number of people in the population every 3 days. So it's exactly the same model in that early stage of the epidemic. It should behave exactly the same way if both models represent the same thing, but they don't. If we zoom in a bit closer, you'll notice that the infected, this red curve, it looks like it peaks at about the same day, and the susceptible goes down very low, but it doesn't go to zero. And the total infected people, they go to zero, which is very different. Let's just put these two curves up together. The compartmental model has many infected people at 100 days, whereas the agent-based model has almost zero infected people at 100 days. The compartmental model here, it has very few susceptible people, but here the agent-based model actually has a few susceptible people left over. And the reason why this curve here, the infected curve, looks so different, and the number of remaining susceptible is so different, is actually because of it's because the resolution of these infections is so different. The agent-based model, people get infected, they start recovering at day 7, 100% of people are recovered by day 21. But in the compartmental model, people are still infected all the way out to infinity. So you get this very, very different curve in both of these models. And where this really comes into being important is when you are talking about what happens when you lock people down. So I decided to simulate something that seems actually pretty reasonable. Like this is what a lot of the world is doing right now. They're hoping for a 90-day lockdown with a 90% reduction in contacts. This is what we're looking at in Australia, similar things in the UK, in New York, in New Zealand. Will it work? Won't it work? Who knows? Let's do some modeling. So firstly, we set up this demonstration model that we've created. We've set the model type to compartmental model. We have increased the model duration to 365 days so we can see what happens after day 100 once we've finished this intervention. Same number of people in the model, same number of initial infected, same median time until recovery, same rate of infection, but what we've changed is the intervention starts at day 20. the intervention lasts for 90 days, and the infection rate reduction goes down by 90%. We did the same thing with the simple agent model. So here, all the same settings as before, same intervention start here, same intervention duration. It's just a little bit different. The way that we talk about it is we're saying we're reducing the number of connections per person. So here you've got the connections per person reduces by 90% here. And so that way we can actually treat the number of connections per person and the probability that you infect a person separately. So if you have another intervention like increased cleaning or people wearing masks or things like that, you can actually set that in here in the infection probability reduction. But we'll look at that later. At the moment, well, we won't look at it later. We really only care about the number of connections per person going down by 90% for 90 days. So let's put these two models next to each other. These two are so different. So in the compartmental model, you'll see that the infected numbers, after you do the intervention, you can see that the intervention happens here. You get a nice steady decrease, but it never reaches zero here. There's still some people who are infected. So when you release those interventions, when you let people out of their homes and start going back onto public transport and visiting restaurants and their workplaces, that infection comes roaring back, and pretty much everyone ends up being infected. It's a very different case for the agent-based model. You have the intervention starts just here, but by about day 70, you have pretty much no one with an infection left. So by the time you lift that intervention, there's no one left to infect anyone. So that short, sharp intervention can completely eliminate infections from the population. The lockdowns can work. The lockdowns can be a way that we can return back to normal. But the compartmental model that the governments have been using don't show that. It shows that no matter what you do, you are kind of a bit screwed. So, you know, this is the current modeling is not showing hope. So I'm going to show you that this actually happens in the real model that at least one government is using. The New Zealand government is using the covidsim.eu model as part of their modeling work, and we'll do exactly the same thing. We'll do a 90% contact reduction. So just to give you an idea about what we're doing, we're using the version 1.0 model because that's what the New Zealand government used at the time. We will set the population size to 10 million, just for example. The number of infected to 100, and the number of infections from outside of the population, this one here, set to 0, because we want to say that the borders are closed down. We've got complete shutdown of lots of workplaces, but no new infections coming in. And then what we do is we set the general contact reduction to 90%, exactly what we did in the last simulation. We set the intervention start to day 60, and we set the contact reduction duration to 90 days. The same thing. And what happens is you get the infection coming back again. So I decided to go completely extreme. What happens if you do instead a 99% reduction for 90 days? And you actually, so here's 99% reduction, contact reduction for 90 days, and you still get back this big peak again. Everyone gets infected again. And so I wanted to look closely at this model, and I looked at it and I saw, you know, infected goes down to 0. What's happening here? This infected, there should be 0 people left in the model to infect people. The problem is that there are not 0 people left in the model. It's actually like 0.1 people left in the model. And so when that 0.1 person is left to go back into the community and start infecting people, you get that epidemic taking over once again. And so because the model never achieves elimination of the virus from the community, you get that epidemic coming back. Now, this is a model that pervades all compartmental SEIR models, and it's a reason not to use compartmental models for any behavioral intervention modeling. It just doesn't work. It will give you the wrong information. So we need to get all the governments to move away from what they're using currently, and it's no particular government. Lots and lots of governments, competent governments around the world are using these sorts of models, but it's the wrong thing to do. So what are the implications of this poor modeling approach? So the implication for policymakers are enormous. When they're given a dire prediction like, no matter how much we self-isolate, this virus will always come back, those politicians will consider locking people down for years to be a reasonable option. And if you're given that sort of information and you're being told like, you're going to lose 3% of your population unless you lock people down, you're thinking, how do we stop these deaths? And this seems like a reasonable approach. But those dire predictions made by the compartmental model actually hide the morally acceptable short-term interventions that can work, which is a short-term intervention, a short, sharp intervention to eliminate infection from the population. Now, this idea has permeated not just governments, but it's permeated popular culture as well. And it comes in the form of the old flatten the curve meme that's been going around. I'll just clear this out here. What has been people have been saying is you're going to get infected no matter what. So what we're going to try and do is reduce the number of infections per day down to a level that the emergency rooms and the ICUs can handle all of the new patients that are coming through and hopefully save some of them. That is ignores what really happens when you reduce the number of people who are infected per day. And that is, if you are successful in reducing the infections from, 3 more people per day, 3 more people per currently infected person. If you reduce that below 1, if for each current infection you go below 1, your epidemic just dies. So you have this short, sharp bit here, and then you get your intervention and it comes down like this. And the area under that graph is much smaller than flattening the curve. It is eliminating the curve. And it's a totally different concept. And this compartmental model meme is making people think that everyone has to get it. It's not the case. Not everyone has to get this infection. If we work on this in each country and we eliminate it from each country, we can hopefully get rid of this infection globally. So infection is possible. To be honest, my opinion is, with the way that the infections are going, that under the current lockdown in Australia, New Zealand, potentially the UK, we could completely eliminate the infection and maintain that elimination as long as all international visitors are sufficiently isolated. So if someone comes in, they have to be quarantined. That's just going to have to be the rule. If we want to run this protection measure to stop people from being infected at all, and we need to keep that fortress around the countries that are not infected from the countries that are infected. So the quarantine is absolutely necessary. Now, the other thing that I think we can be talking about is we could potentially speed up this elimination and bring back that 90-day quarantine by making further adjustments, such as requiring face masks in public to ensure mini outbreaks don't happen among critical workers, such as doctors and nurses and cleaners and shop assistants and people who are working the logistics system. If we can get all of those people to wear masks, it won't completely eliminate the infections in those groups. But if we reduce it by, say, 50%, we can actually slow down that spread and hopefully just stop this epidemic in its tracks. So what's the impact on economics? So if the epidemic modeling delivers poor results, it will provide an incorrect basis for business decisions and the necessary stimulus and welfare packages. Like any system, garbage in, garbage out. Not to say that these models are garbage, but the outcome of the behavioral interventions are just incorrect. So those economic responses are all going to be incorrect. So while I would caution against relying too heavily on modeling, especially my modeling in this current form, agent-based modeling provides a hope that we previously didn't have, that we can eliminate COVID-19 from our community, and the pain would be measured in months rather than years. And this can give both business and citizens the strength and determination to stick out the lockdown and be ready to exit the other side with all pistons firing. Now, I think that there is a little bit of blame here, and I don't want to be too harsh on people, because I think that the response to this epidemic has been correct. We need to limit the spread, stop the deaths, stop the ICU wards from filling up. So I don't fault the governments of the world acting decisively on the basis of the modeling provided so far. All the actions that they've taken, fast actions were necessary. And it's bought us time, and now we can determine the best path forward. But the big issue that I see is that this model, this modeling was kept secret for far too long. So we're in April now, and the government had modeling being done for several months. They've even, waited a very long time since people were talking about the modeling, like, hey, where's the modeling? They waited a long time to even release that. And I think there's a fear that that this modeling would scare people. And I think that's true. This modeling will absolutely scare people. 3% of people will die. How scary is that? You don't want to go to the public and say that without being sure of it, without, making sure that you haven't got some problem. But once you've decided that you're going to tell the public, because it's evident that serious action was necessary by all people in society, these models used to inform these choices should have been released. They should have done it at the same time. Everyone's going to die. Well, no, not everyone. 3% of people are going to die. Lots of people are going to get very sick. We're going to lock everyone down. Here's the reasons why we're going to do it. Here's the model that we use to inform this. Because in the meantime, academics, well, I'm not really an academic now, but I'm a former academic. I haven't had the opportunity to investigate this model. So I couldn't say the government's doing bad modeling because I didn't know what the model was. I just assumed that they were using state-of-the-art modeling because, myself and all of my colleagues had moved past compartmental models onto individual-based models. They're much more expensive to make. They're much harder to write. They take longer to run. They demonstrate how uncertain you are about all of the assumptions that you make, but they're much more accurate than the models that are being used by governments right now. Compartmental SEIR models have huge limitations. So we need to be more open about what we're doing when we have such a disaster on our doorstep, because this isn't some enemy that we need to keep secret from. There aren't, Japanese agents working out, how can we attack Australia or America or the UK? This is nothing like World War II, right? This is about a common enemy amongst all people of the world. So we need to be as open as possible with the models that we use and the reasons why we're doing this, because we are living in a world where the public is giving so much faith into the government that, we are going to give up all of our rights to move around, to assemble, to talk with people in real life, to talk privately with people. At the moment, all of our communications are going through online means, most of which are under surveillance either by Western nations or by Russian or Chinese agents. That means there's no privacy. We're giving that up. As a people, we're saying we are giving up our rights to freedom because we need to do this together. So the trade-off that I think we should have is that we need the government to be as honest as possible with us so that people like myself can go in and take a look at these models and say, actually, we could be doing this a different way and come out with an even better result. Okay, well, thank you for listening to my presentation. If you want to have a play with that model, go to covidagentmodel.com. If you want to contact me about this, if you're media and you want a bit more information, or if you are a government and you want to be set up with a individual-based model, if you're an organization that wants to take a look at modeling to see, business projections and stuff like that, please send me an email and I can help you out with some of those assumptions. If I can't help you, I can pass you on to someone who can. So thank you for listening.